So I'll give you a brief, very quick overview of our company because it's relevant to what I'm going to talk about. I think I've also got a member of my board of directors here today, so if I plead for more money, that's why. It's a subtext. But and one of my regulators is also here, so I got to be careful. So we're the largest power company in Ontario. We're an offshoot of what used to be called Ontario Hydro, and we run right now about 66 power dams, a couple of hundred control dams on rivers, 2 nuclear plants. We lease a nuclear plant, and we have 2 biomass plants up in the northwest. And relevant to where I'm going to get into in a minute is back in the old days, we used to show up in communities and say, we're here, get out of the way. There was a common good. We've decided, I mean, there was no community consultation, particularly with Indigenous communities. We're building, get out of the way. We're about to flood, we're going to build a plant. That was just the way it was done. And then back around the 90s, one of our senior leaders, and he took a lot of flack internally, decided this model wasn't working. It wasn't going to be the way of the future. And so a fellow named Sam Horton, who was quite visionary, reached out to the Wabaseemonk First Nation and said, we want to make amends for flooding your lands. And this started what now would be a reconciliation process, but we recently completed our 23rd settlement of past grievances, which internally set a new path for the company in the way we treat communities as a whole. Out of those past grievances, we've launched a number of partnerships with First Nations, which created equity, also created jobs, created opportunities. They revenue share off of that. And so this really sparked a conversation in the company. How do we do engagement? How do we talk to communities, regardless of where they are? And so which leads me to a project called the Portlands Energy Center. And is just as a side to that, we also have remarkable support from our nuclear communities. If we wanted to build a nuclear plant today in our Clarenton, Darlington site, the community would stand up and say, oh, please start. We want you here. The rest of the province may be another issue, but we certainly have strong local support for these projects, and that goes beyond just the jobs. It's also just the way we treat them. So, on this project called the Portlands Energy Center, it's a gas plant in the middle of downtown Toronto. It was built on the context of getting off of coal. It predated the famous Oakville plant, and I don't want to get into energy policy in Ontario because it's an hour-long subject or a 5-hour-long subject. I do want to say I wish I had this book when I was starting out on the project. It would have given me a good direction on where not to go and what I could do. But so we were given the task of building this power plant. It's not too far from my house, which is relevant to my story. And we went through the normal EA process, and the EA process, I think, created a lot of barriers for us because the process by definition meant that you had to look at the worst case scenarios, which was a plant that ran forever. It ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year, which was not what it was intended to do. It was very specific use to be a very specific need for power in downtown Toronto. But having to walk back from that EA approval, so the people said, well, no, your EA says you're going to run forever. This is the amount of pollution you're going to produce. It was a very difficult challenge from a regulatory point of view. There was no focus on how you were actually going to operate, and that was a challenge that we faced every day in the conversations. So we had the usual EA processes. We had open houses. This created distrust. It created a lot of animosity in the community. Nobody was quite sure who this project was. It was a company that was a partnership of us and TransCanada, but the people involved very deliberately didn't talk about the partners. So people thought it was a company in Texas. People thought it was a company from out west, which apparently was worse than Texas in a Toronto context. And so then we got into this conversation when I talked. We said, well, let's treat this as if it was a project that was already built. How would we deal with this if it was one of our host community projects? So we very deliberately went out and said, okay, we're going to treat you like we do everywhere else. We're not going to treat you like an EA process. And that kind of fundamentally was what we would loosely define as an OPG way of dealing with communities. And one is every project and community is different. Every person is different. Why they support and why they oppose is different. It doesn't matter, that they all have their own reasons, and they could be close to the same reason, but they all have their own reasons. Respect for communities, empathy for communities. You're showing up in their place and you're going to say, we're going to do something that is changing your landscape. And that takes people, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be a Walmart, it could be a Canadian Tire, which was built at the same time as ours. People don't like change, and you have to respect that and be conscious of it. Patience. We just finished a project with the Moose Cree First Nation that was launched when I started in the company in '89. We finally finished it about 3 years ago. It took that long to bring the Moose Cree to a point where they said, yeah, we can accept this project and we will support it. And we had come to the point that if you wouldn't support it, we wouldn't build it. And so this took a lot of patience, and on the ground level, it meant that I personally, and other people, had to spend a lot of time in church basements, parking lots, restaurants when I got accosted. People stopping me on the street because I got known as the Portland's guy, which wasn't a celebratory term in the community. But just patients to sit and talk and listen and try to understand where they're coming from and provide them information. And we talked about energy literacy. You'd be surprised when people are against a project how literate they actually are. How much it meant that I had to know why they were opposed to this, what their research was, where they were getting it. If you want to find information about something, particularly if you oppose it, it's easy to find. Flexibility. The plan that we started out with was not the plan that we ended up with in terms of talking to the community. People also, we run very on, people want access to deciders. They grew to like me, and they grew to value the fact that I respected them. But they very clearly understood that there was certain decision levels I couldn't have. I wasn't able to say, yeah, we'll make the paneling this way, or we'll do the landscaping that way. That was so we had to make sure that the community engagement was done by people who actually understood community engagement. Some of the folks that we had on the project who went on to be involved in projects that weren't as successful, no, we're building it the way we want. I don't care what you think. And that was really the conversation in some meetings, so we had to very quickly say, that's not really the right person. We'll find somebody else to engage these levels of conversation. And we also found that, and this is something that we've noticed, and we've seen failures of other companies, that local representation, someone who lives in the community, is really, really important, someone who can understand the community. And so that as we went through the project, we went very quickly to we found out why people opposed it, and we found there was a number of reasons that opposition. Some of the business community, I should say, it was a business transaction with the city. We made a fundamental mistake with the city, and the city made a fundamental mistake with us in thinking that we were like a condominium. They didn't understand our pricing model. We didn't understand that when they were opposing us, it was really a negotiation, that they were familiar under this thing called Section 37 of the Planning Act, which allowed them to get community benefit agreements. Because they took that stance and wouldn't talk to us, we couldn't build into our funding envelope any community impact agreements that we could usually do on other projects that were not funded in this way. So when we finally got all our official approvals, there was this sort of sudden moment of, what do you mean you don't have any money? I said, well, if you had talked to us, but if we were going to do it again, we'd understand them. And we didn't. That was a mistake that we made, and a mistake that they made in negotiating with us. But we were also able, by figuring out who was opposing it, we were able to micro-target really what they were up to and why they were concerned. And so we would go and speak to them forever. I would go to every opposition meeting that they had. I introduced myself politely and said, I'd like to be here. I'll speak if you want, but more likely I'd like to listen to what you've got to say. They would just go away, they'd discuss it, and then they would say, sure, we'll let Ted in at the back and let him have, just to have hear what we're up to. And then we also found, as we poked around, there was an awful lot of supporters in the community. And it's relatively easy for us, because power plant, you can kind of draw a line and say, this is the area that it really impacts. It's not like a pipeline where you're crossing large jurisdictions and hundreds of communities. But we realized there was a lot of support. We realized that there was a lot of vestige from vestige memory from the blackout in 2003. People did understand electricity reliability. They were worried about blackouts. People, sometimes they were opposed to us on political grounds. It was a nasty downtown liberal NDP fight, which made it, okay, this is not about power plants, it's about politics, which changed the conversation. There were some local parts of that were the local utility wanted to build a plant. We won a bid over them, so that made a complicated factor. They weren't particularly happy about that. We also found that people opposed to it because they were, and I think that Lisa DeMarco talked about that earlier, about this, they wanted a brave new future, and they didn't want the in-between. They wanted the new future now. And so a lot of the conversation was, well, there is a new future coming, but you do need to keep the lights on in between, and this is better than coal. this is better than the alternatives that we've got. And so this was a really interesting experience, and I think it eventually led, we had a very active community liaison group that had some people eventually walk out. We had to find new members. Recently, though, the community liaison group said, we don't really need to be as active as we were. It's a very valuable part of the community. It's a very trusted part of the community. When we do a thing called Doors Open Toronto, there's about 1,000 people go through the plant. So it's now an accepted part of the community. But at first it was in a very, very angry environment, nasty letters in my mailbox, a lot of really angry people at meetings. But we were able to overcome them by using that anger by showing trust, showing respect, and showing that we did actually care about their feelings. But I will say that for the future, one of the things that we'll find is, and this is similar to our Indigenous project, that whole community involvement piece is going to be complicated because there is that expectation of people. We had people asking us or demanding that they wanted to tell us when they could run. And they could say, we'll tell you when you can run this plant, because if it's a smoggy day, we don't want you to run. And you're kind of saying, well, if we don't run and it's a smoggy day, more than likely we're needed, the lights may go out. And that was a really tender conversation that we had. And I think, but that will be, from project development, that greater expectation of community action. And the odd part for us is we actually do that on our hydro systems. About the mid-90s, we started a process with MNR and other groups figuring out how we actually will operate our hydro systems and the waterways. And so we factor in fish spawning, we factor in water treatment plants, we factor in things like whitewater canoe weekends, we factor in cottage weekends and all that sort of thing, and that manages the water flow. But because of the way this particular plant was structured, we couldn't actually do that. But I think that's going to be the wave of the future, is a greater community expectation of some sort of revenue sharing, some sort of community involvement in operations, and some direct control with management, and management actually understanding that they have to listen. So I'll end there. But you can get to yes, but it does take a lot of work and it does take a lot of patience. So.